Good day, everyone. Yeah, I just decided I should say good day instead of depending on what time you're watching. It could be good evening, I guess. Okay, so yeah, the last lecture on feminist concerns in the philosophy of science. Well, the last lecture we're going to be dealing with. So next week we turn our attention for Monday's lecture to issues of race, and particularly in the medical profession. It should be an interesting essay. I haven't actually taught it before. I added it. It's relatively new. So we had an extra class this semester. I forget why, but in any event, I added it in at the end because I thought it sort of relates to the same things, this idea of bias and stereotypes and history affecting our observations, how we make observations, what we interpret, and everything. So take a look at that. We'll see how that goes. Obviously, I'm not going to know if it goes well or not because I'm just recording it and sort of sending it out there. But I'd love to hear feedback. I'd love to hear feedback on any of these, but I'd love to hear feedback on that one particularly. So yeah, so we'll do that, and then that's really it. So just as a reminder, then looking forward, I'll remind you next week as well. The deadline for the final essays, it's on the syllabus, it's on Blackboard. I'm assuming everybody got a chance to look at the handout for the final essay. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. We went over all this. It's similar to the midterm, a bit longer. If you have to use that, you have to use that outside source. If you're having trouble there, let me know. Yeah, so draft deadline is the end of next week, so Friday, May 1st. I'll remind you again next week. And then, right, so we're supposed to have classes Monday and Wednesday of next week. So as a reminder, next Monday's lecture will be our last lecture. And then on Wednesday, during our class time, I'll send everyone an invitation to a Zoom meeting where I'll be there. You can ask any questions you want on the final essay. There's anything that you need to review that you're working on for the final. If you want to go over maybe Kuhn's idea of a paradigm or what Licato said about research programs or whatever, I'm here for you as a resource. Likewise, if you're having trouble finding an outside source, we could work on that then. Um, yeah, so what I guess all this is to say that on the 29th, there's going to be no sort of directed lecture from me. I'm merely here to answer any questions that you would have, and it's not required. If you're good to go on writing it, there's no need to log in. Just, I mean, if you want to just say hi, that'd be cool. We all need sort of, some sort of human contact right now. But yeah, it's certainly not required. I'm not going to be taking attendance or anything like that. It's really up to you. But I'll send that out. I'll remind you again next week. Okay, so yeah, let's jump in then. Yeah, so, well, I guess, first of all, that is not a typo. That is how Sarah Blaffer Hrdy spells her last name. Um, yeah, I had actually, it was a few years ago, I was applying for a job. I think it might have even been a different position at Rowan. And no, it couldn't have been at Rowan because they would have known that. Oh, it was at Temple. That's what it was. When I was still at Temple, I was having someone read over an application that I was doing. And I listed as part of a lesson plan this essay from Senator Blaffer Hrdy is how I would deal with issues of gender and race and things like this in philosophy of science. And they had sent me back a comment, be like, you misspelled her last name all over the place. And I'm like, nah, it's not actually misspelled. That's how her name is actually spelled. So, in that case, yeah, so anyway, a little aside. But yeah, so her goal here, like I said, is going to be to give a more, I guess, practical real world example of why issues of gender matter in the sciences, what women researchers bring to the table and what male researchers miss, right? So we had mentioned on Monday this essay from Sandra Harding, I think, was a bit more esoteric, avant-garde, abstract, a bit further out there than I think a lot of, I guess it's science sort of skews a bit more traditional. And without like a history in gender studies or Marxism, for instance, it might not have seemed as convincing because of because it is largely speculative. So I mentioned at the end of the lecture, I think that what Hrdy is doing here might actually be a bit more helpful to us, or might give you more reason to perhaps consider this position that she gives, that we don't want a genderless view of science. We want a variety of gendered perspectives. So gender should matter in a positive way. That bias can be a benefit as well as lead to errors, right? So this is what she does here with this look at sexuality, reproduction, and mating among animals and the stereotypes that we bring to the table and how we sort of interpret what we see there. So yeah, so Senator Blaffer Hrdy, really interesting figure in primatology and anthropology. UC Davis, Harvard. I listed her books here if anyone is interested in her sort of research. And if you're interested in today's and in the reading that you had for today and in today's lecture, certainly these would be interesting reads, and I think you would find them interesting. Yeah, so what's her goal here? I mean, this is sort of how I like to start these lectures off. Like, what's her overall goal? It's to examine the origins of this myth of the coy female and what its continuing influence is. So it begins with like defining what this myth of the coy female is. She defines this near the beginning. Males are sexually indiscriminate, right? Meaning, and females then are sexually discriminate or sexually restrained, right? So in when looking at animal mating rituals, what we're going to find are males that will mate with as many females as possible and will do so, regardless of the social status or the biology of those females. So what this myth tells us is that males will often have very little concern for the social status of their mating partners. Right? It doesn't matter to a male if he is mating with a higher status or a lower status female within the social group. The male will mate with uh, females from a variety of biological perspectives, meaning that it won't be like the sort of the fittest female that he's looking for, the one that has, that is the strongest or the fastest or the smartest or whatever, right? Social status and biology matter little to males. They're sexually indiscriminate. They don't care. Right? On the other hand, females are sexually discriminate or restrained. Means is that females of most species are often more reluctant to mate than males. And when they do mate, they're much more discriminating than males. So whereas where males will mate with as many females as possible and have little concern for their biological or social status, females will, when they do mate, will be much more discriminating. They're only going to mate with the males that have a better genetic heritage or a higher social standing, right? The lower standing males are largely left out of mating. This is the myth that this myth of the coy female tells. So yeah, and she says, this applies through most species. Anything from a fruit fly, like Bateman discusses, all the way up to chimpanzees, it was thought. There are very few counterexamples that are thought to exist. When they do, they're considered a biological rarity. So something like male seahorses becoming pregnant. Aside from these biological detours, the myth of the coy female that males are sexually indiscriminate, whereas females are more sexually restrained is going to apply across different species and across a wide variety of animals. So what Hrdy wants to do then is to show the origins of this myth, why it's rarely true, and how it can be overcome. Right? So she starts with the origins of this myth. And she says, what I first want to do is examine the beliefs that we have regarding gender, and then look at the science that was created to support those beliefs. So I say this in my lecture when I'm doing it in class. I wrote it here. Right? We can already see one problem with that. The order of events here seems off, right? So, right, the science shouldn't be created to support our beliefs. Our beliefs should be created in support of the science, right? So already we're working backwards. We're bringing our beliefs about gender and gender stereotypes to the table, and then looking for support with them from observations, rather than making neutral observations and then letting them form our beliefs regarding mating and gender and sexuality. Yeah. So then she also says, okay, so I want to look at where these myths begin. And then I want to show multiple examples. Most of her examples are from primatology to show that this myth is largely true. And finally, I want to show how these biases can be overcome by focusing on the gender of the researcher themselves, by showing why the gender of the one making the observation matters. Yeah, her argument's basically going to be for adopting this feminist standpoint theory that we had discussed last class in primatology, that these gendered perspectives are beneficial and we need these differently gendered perspectives for an adequate representation of behavior. Her argument is that female researchers might empathize with or understand female subjects in a way that offers insights that male researchers might overlook, that male researchers might not relate to or might miss something with the subjects that female researchers would catch. So, yeah, I mean, these gender stereotypes go back centuries or millennia, right? But at least, where she situates their first scientific or biological basis is from Darwin. So this relatively later work, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, but this was published about 10 years before Darwin died. So I'm thinking maybe 10 to 15 years after Origin of Species was published, I believe. I think Origin of Species was 1859, somewhere around there. But yeah, looking at how he applies natural selection to mating, sexuality, and reproduction. So, what Darwin argues from his observations is that when we look at matings across a variety of species, the male is always going to be the what's called the wooer, the one who tries to impress the females, whether that's through plumage in birds, whether that's through a feat of strength with primates, or even you see this often with deer, for instance, and rams and things like this that do these sort of headbutting things. Giraffes are incredibly violent when the males compete, right? So males will try to woo females, whether that's through displays of some kind or through challenges to other males. And then the female is the one that picks the mate from among her suitors. This is the terminology that's used in Darwin. So yeah, so two issues immediately jump out here. The first is this language that he's using as wooer and suitors, and this tends to anthropomorphize animals in a way that might be unhelpful. It's unclear, there's a risk that when we anthropomorphize animals, when we refer to the males as wooers and the females picking their mate from her suitors, that we tend to think of animals too closely related to humans, not just in behavior, but in motivations for behavior. So again, this affects how we do research. If in the context of it, we're looking at males and females of any species in the same context as men and women. This leads to a lot of these gender stereotypes and a lot of these problematic gender stereotypes. Um, Along with that, though, is that even though it seems here that the female is the active agent here in picking, right, that it's still this idea of the passive female that we get from these gender stereotypes throughout history. So this idea that, well, she's not really active. It's not like she's going out and looking for a mate. Essentially, she's, getting these males paraded in front of her and she's sort of pointing one out is the story that's being told here, that they'll perform whatever their performative duty is in front of her, and then she sort of picks one. So it's still very passive on her end. She's picking from a selection that has already been presented to her. So this is all anecdotal for Darwin, right? So he notes these behaviors in nature. He notes them across different species that he observes, but his observations are really limited. They're certainly not controlled. There's no suggestion as to that these behaviors must be associated with mating. It's not a large sample size. So in comes John Angus Bateman. Yeah, great name. John Angus, right? So John Angus wants to use Bateman's work as inspiration for his own studies on reproductive variance in fruit flies in the 1940s. Yeah, essentially Bateman thought that Darwin's speculations were generally correct. What he was seeing is common behavior amongst most species, this myth of the coy female, that males are sexually dominant while females are sexually restrained, males are sexually indiscriminate while females are sexually discriminant. He thought that Darwin was correct, but he just didn't have either the capability to or the inclination to give a full-throated scientific defense of these claims that he is making. So this is what Bateman wants to do. What Bateman wants was to examine what he calls the rates of reproductive variance, the rates of reproductive success for both males and females with respect to the number of matings that occur. So when he talks about reproductive success, what success means here is success in passing on one's genes. So mating success, reproductive success or mating success doesn't mean like mating success occurs when mating occurs, right? Mating success only occurs when you're passing on your genetic lines. So mating might occur, but variance, reproductive success might not occur if the female is not ovulating, or if the mating is interrupted, or whatever, right? Reproductive variance, reproductive success only occurs when mating occurs and when mating is successful, when pregnancy occurs and the genetic line is passed along. So Bateman's results of fruit flies he thought demonstrated two things. First, that male reproductive variance, male reproductive success increases with each additional mating. Each time a male mates, it makes it more likely that that male's genetic line is going to be carried on. Female reproductive variance plateaus after a single mating, though. Each additional mating after the first will not increase the likelihood of passing on a genetic information. So after the first mating, the female's genetic line is no more likely to be carried on with each additional mating. Yeah, each additional mating beyond the first of the male, right, could result in additional offspring, right? So every time a male mates with a different female, there's a chance that he could pass on his genetic line if that female becomes pregnant. Obviously, this isn't true with females, right? Once a female is pregnant, additional mating serve no genetic purpose. So this is the basis of what he thought Darwin's work said, was that because males could, well, let's go forward. Yeah, this has several implications. This is what I was thinking. Competition for mates is always going to be greater among males, and that females become choosy or coy with who they mate with. So the idea is sort of this. Um, Females have to be more discriminate because of their lower variance. If for a male, I can mate with as many females as I want, and my genetic variant, or sorry, my reproductive variance increases with each mating. I don't really, have too much consideration as to any one particular mating, right? I sort of, try to mate as much as possible to have as much genetic variance or as much reproductive variance or genetic success as possible. With females, though, because that first mating is what's important. What Bateman argued and what he thought Darwin argued was that females would be more, I guess, discriminate in who they mate with. A male with better biological lineage or social lineage would be better suited to carry on her genetic line. And because she only has one shot at carrying on her genetic line, she's going to be much more choosy, much more particular as to who she mates with. Also, if a male can produce as many offspring as they want, they're not going to be too terribly invested in any one offspring. Right? If the only concern is continuing the genetic line, what do I care if one of my offspring isn't faring well or dies or whatever? I'll just go out and reproduce again. For females, they're going to invest much more care in offspring since they can produce far less offspring. Since they need, the time of pregnancy, the fact that one can only be pregnant once at a time. All of this means that they're going to take more care of any offspring that do occur because they have invested so much more in them. Yeah, so you put these together and you have this claim summarized by Hrdy on 133 that whichever sex invests the least in offspring will compete to mate with the sex investing the most. Right? So competition is greater among males because females are more discriminate into who they mate with. So these are the two assumptions that Hrdy wants to challenge. First, that males are sexually promiscuous while females are coy, choosy, reluctant to mate. And also that females invest more than males in child rearing, giving their lower reproductive variance or lower chance of reproductive success. Yeah, so to disprove this, she first looks at lower animals. So she wants to look for instances where females are not choosy or coy or discriminate in their mating, and also to show that females are not only concerned with passing on genetic lineage, that they're not only concerned with reproductive variance. So what this would show is what she essentially wants to look for is a variety of mating practices among females and dispel this myth. And this myth could be dispelled by females being indiscriminate in their mating, or females mating at a time or in a way that reproduction could not occur, right? So mating when they are not ovulating or out of estrus, right? Any of these would show that Darwin's views and Bateman's views are incorrect. And this is what she finds. So she first looks to lower animals. She says, everywhere in the animal kingdom, you can find instances where these views don't. Blackbirds. So this is a red-winged blackbird. Red-winged blackbirds form harems, meaning there's one dominant male that has a host of females that form this harem. And it's thought that the dominant male is the one that controls sexual access. So the dominant male red-winged blackbird controls when and how mating happens, and the females are bound to that one dominant male in the breeding group, it's called, right? That they only carry the offspring of the dominant male. What we find is that if you castrate the male of a blackbird harem, the harem doesn't fall apart, but somehow the females still get pregnant. showing that there's much more variation and variety in female mating than we suspected. In fish, female fish will often mate outside of ovulation because they can store sperm for up to like, I don't know, close to a year. There was just a story that guppies, which is what these are, a male guppy could reproduce 10 months after it had died because the females wait and store sperm until they're ovulating in order to reproduce. I think she says like female lions will mate over, over 100 times in a week when they're in estrus, which, yeah. But again, all of these demonstrate this and demonstrate this some challenges to this myth. So, though she sort of focuses at the beginning on these lower animals, I put lower in quotes because whatever. She's mostly concerned with primates. Why? I mean, the first is her background, right? She's most familiar with primates given her own research as a primatologist. But it's not just that. It's not like she's just like, well, this is what I do, so it's what I'm going to focus on. She does think that the differences between this myth of the female being coy or restrained or discriminate, the differences between that myth and reality are most pronounced in primates and non-human apes. And also that we have the most similarities with primates, so we might be more aware of these differences or how these primates break from this myth because we see a similarity between us and them. So yeah, there's a whole host of primate species whose females break from Bateman's model of being coy or sexually selective. Yeah, both in who they're mating and how often and when mating occurs. So primates who the female primates that mate with a variety of males that aren't sexually discriminate, but also when they mate, how often they mate, are they mating outside of ovulation? All of these would suggest that the female is not overly concerned with low genetic or low reproductive variance. Yeah, so Barbary macaques, these little guys. The females here will often, when they're, will often mate with most males in their group, right? So not only with the dominant male, but males from a variety of social and genetic standings. So they're not looking for the fittest or the highest social standing of a mate. They're mating across the board with a variety of men within their breeding group. And it's thought also that this happens when the females are not ovulating. So there's no chance of pregnancy occurring or carrying on a genetic lineage. And it's thought that, like a lot of primates, that this is done to reinforce social bonds, that matings reinforce bonds among the social group. That has nothing to do with reproduction. Savanna baboons mate for largely the same reason. Outside of ovulation, also with a variety of males within their social group. Um, yeah, she talks about this. So this is her study. Her first book on was on langurs. These langurs, she says, she would often, when she was doing this, she was at Harvard doing her PhD, and she had said she would watch these female langurs like just leave their social group and take off with like an all male breeding group, a group of all dominant young males, and mate with all of them. I think she said this, that her Harvard trained eyes had no sort of reference for such a thing, and she found it scandalous and shocking that this would occur. Um, but yeah, so again, not being sexually selective, not being sexually discriminate, mating with a variety of males, largely unconcerned with social standing or biology or whether or not reproduction could occur, right? So what she demonstrates, and again, this is just three examples, there's a lot of other examples, is that females will mate outside of ovulation and will mate with a variety of males over a large swath of non-human primates. Yeah, they won't just mate with the ones with the best genes or the best social standing or when pregnancy is likely to occur. So, why? She highlights first three sets of circumstances when a female would mate with males other than those at the top of this breeding group or the top of the social hierarchy of their own sort of, natural group. Right? So sometimes you'll witness an all-male group will join the breeding group, and in this case, the females will mate with all of the males in this new all-male group. Sometimes a female will leave her own group and go out in search of an all-male group and mate with all the males from that group, so actively leaving their own group in search of these all-male breeding groups. And so sometimes the female will, take a shine to a specific male from another group, and she'll leave her group permanently. She'll abandon her breeding group and take up with the other one. So the question becomes like, why would they do this? What's the payoff for the females? And I think this is really important to her discussion here. Because these types of interactions have risk for the females, both to the female and to her offspring. Yeah, taking up with someone outside of your breeding group carries risks. The female, the mother, if there's offspring, could be injured or killed. They could risk being abandoned by their original breeding group if they're not leaving permanently, right? That their group would ostracize them, and thus they would be unprotected and without a social group. Um, the new infant might be killed by the dominant male of their breeding group when they come back. We'll return to this. She talks about, there are sexually transmitted infections among non-human primates that carry risk as well. So why? Like, what's the payoff here? There has to be some reason that they're doing this because there's a risk to it. So they must get something out of it aside from just matings. So there are two different hypotheses here. Yeah, they're called the prostitution hypothesis and the manipulation hypothesis. So the prostitution hypothesis, we're probably all familiar with, even if we're not familiar with the term. So this idea that basically it's argued by some researchers that females of various species will trade sexual access for protection and resources. So females will mate with males so that males feel an obligation to protect them or an obligation to provide them food and resources and shelter and these types of things. And thus, the more males that one mates with, the greater the resources or protectors that one has. Right? So it's in the female's best interest to get as many males on her side to provide for her as possible. The manipulation hypothesis says something quite different. Instead of trading sexual access for protection and resources, what happens is the females realize that if they mate with a variety of different males, they're better able to what's called disguise paternity. In other words, if I am a male Langer, for instance, and I know that I have mated with a female, and I know that she has not left the group, no other males have entered the group. If she is pregnant and gives birth to offspring, I know that's my offspring, and I know it's not someone else's, right? Also, if I am that male and I haven't mated with that female, I know that can't be my offspring if she gives birth, right? So, what this manipulation hypothesis suggests is that females are mate with as many males as possible so that no male is sure which offspring is his, right? Okay, I think that one might be mine. We did mate. There's no, is it Maury or there's no paternity test in primates, right? So disguising paternity is effective so that a variety of males are tricked into thinking that the offspring is theirs. It can't be all of theirs, but none of them are sure which one it is. So in essence, what they're saying here is that the female dupes the males in her group into taking care of a child that isn't theirs, essentially, right? Want to guess which one male researchers like more? Yeah, this prostitution hypothesis is much more favored by men because it makes males the active agents here, right? They're the ones, the providers, the protectors. The females are giving up sexual access for these resources that men have. Men are the important ones here. The manipulation hypothesis is not favored by male researchers at all. I mean, not at all, but it's a much harder sell for male researchers. Historically, it's relatively newer than the prostitution hypothesis. And part of that is because, the males are not the active agent there. The females are. The females are the one disguising paternity, the ones being active and sort of tricking the males. And it's not seen, the males aren't generally seen as great a light there. So the question still, though, is like, why would a female want to, I'm sorry, that should be fake paternity, not make paternity. Why would a female want to fake paternity? If Bateman and Darwin's hypothesis holds, the males have little to do with child rearing. So who cares if a bunch of males think the child is theirs if they're largely indifferent to that child? One reason is that it protects the offspring. So at the end here, she discusses Langers. This comes from her first book, from her second book, in her dissertation, where she's talking about how when a new Langer becomes dominant, um, they'll murder or kill the offspring that aren't theirs because their goal is to pass on their genetic line. So when a female has young offspring, she won't ovulate for up to I think she says like a year. But killing that offspring will sort of force ovulation again. She'll be ready to breed again with this new dominant male's offspring. Right? So masking paternity here effectively tricks this new male who comes into social dominance into not being sure when he was not the dominant male, maybe that's his kid, maybe that's his offspring, maybe that's his genetic line, so he's less inclined to kill offspring, thus the female's genetic line is protected even if it's not actually his. Yeah, masculine paternity protects the female's genetic line. Okay, well, what about what about species where infanticide is not a common practice? Why would a female want to trick males into believing offspring is theirs? Right? Yeah, her point is that if females want males to think that offspring is theirs, the males must bring something to the table. They must have some participation in childbearing that's beneficial for the female to have more of them caring for her child, and it's something that Darwin and Bateman simply missed. So, what female researchers have suggested is that males are much more active participants in childbearing than females. This is often overlooked by male researchers. Their own experiences sort of cloud their observations here in ways that sort of that Harding discusses last class regarding activity and agency and things like this. Territory perimeter is a great example. So this is the one that I had suggested last class. So effectively, it was thought that like males in a lot of primate species take very little active role in childbearing. So they would, regularly walk. This would be common in maybe chimpanzees, for instance. They regularly walk the perimeter of their territory, but um, they're largely indifferent to the offspring that follow behind them. Um, what this actually is education for the young offspring to show them the perimeter of their area. So the males are taking an active role, not just in guarding or walking their perimeter, but in demonstrating where their area ends to offspring. To say, up to this point, you are safe. Do not go beyond this point because you will not be, right? But because they weren't like taking an active role, it just looked like the children following them around. This was missed by a lot of researchers. Play in general, how males interact with offspring, is often not seen as activity or work by male researchers, or was not historically, or this is at least Hardy's argument from last class. Thus, it's missed that this becomes important, that this is valuable in some ways. So, yeah, all of this is to say, what Sarah Bluffer Hardy wants to do here is to demonstrate that there are things that we need female researchers for. That there's in some ways she has this section on empathy in here where says, female researchers, she found herself empathizing with female langurs and asking, how what under what circumstances would I allow a male to come in and murder my offspring? Under what circumstances would I want to protect them? How would I protect them? And this gives her, these ideas regarding masculine paternity and things like this. Yeah, this idea that the males are sexually dominant or the males are sexually indiscriminate while females are not. We carry that into this based on these erroneous gender stereotypes that we have. And because that's our history and our background and our standpoint, or it's the history and background and standpoint of male researchers, they risk overlooking things like, Barbary macaques or, these varieties of mating practices among primates or other animals. That what we need are a variety of gendered perspectives to catch these things, that this is what becomes important, right? So yeah, so like I said, this was really, there's not for our purposes, it's not like there's a different argument being presented by Hardy than you see from uh, uh, Sandra Harding, but that it's more of a, hey, this is a really good example of like when we need a gendered perspective, when we need female primatologists to come in and make these observations because they come from a different perspective, a different background, a different standpoint that allows them to see things that male researchers might miss, that allows them to focus on things that male researchers might overlook, right? And again, this is not to say that the male standpoint is not important, but it should not be the only standpoint. It should not be the only perspective in the sciences is the argument here that all that we risk bias as error when we only have one standpoint. And the more standpoints we can bring to the table, the better off science is for it, is going to be the argument. So, yeah, if you have any questions about this or anything else, shoot me an email, set up some time to meet. And if I don't hear from you, I will post the lecture on racism among the well-intentioned on Monday. And then on Wednesday of next week, we'll have the optional class, and that'll be it. So, yeah, shoot me an email if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll see you all on Monday. Oh, yeah, I'll post grades for the response paper 6 before Monday as well, and we'll go over that at the beginning of class. So, if you turn that in. Yeah, so, okay, cool. All right, I will talk to everyone soon. Be safe, wash your hands, have a good weekend.